Hi, I'm Mark, and on this channel I talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view, although I do know the UK from the inside as well. Especially since it was clear that there might be a change of government in the UK, the discussion started again if the UK could rejoin the EU to repair all the damages caused by Brexit. But it's not possible for the UK to rejoin the EU, at least not in the sense of the word. And that's the bad news. The good news for all those in favor of rejoining is that the UK could join the EU again. But this little semantic game is important because the conditions for joining would be quite different. And it would never be a fast process. That's why I decided to shed some light on the process again if the UK ever decides to join again. And especially since the polls show us that many say they are against Brexit and want to rejoin the EU, but do not know what that really would mean. The accession of a state to the European Union is a complex and multi-stage process that can take several years. And this process is laid down in the so-called Copenhagen criteria and the Treaty on the European Union. And the procedure that I'm now explaining would also apply to the UK. And it would first start with the application. A European state that wants to become a member of the EU must first formally submit an application for membership to the European Council. That's the body of the heads of state and government of the EU member states. And this application signals that the state has a desire to join the EU. The European Council examines the application then and decides whether to recognize the state as a potential candidate for accession. And this decision, which is based on the Copenhagen criteria which were established in 1993, and they include a few points. The state must have stable institutions that guarantee democracy, but also the rule of law, human rights, and the protection of minorities. The state must have a functioning market economy that is able to withstand competitive pressure within the EU. And the state must have the ability to fully adopt and implement EU legislation. That's the so-called acquis communautaire. Secondly, we have the candidate status then, if that worked. If the European Council decides that the state meets the basic requirements, it grants it the official status of a candidate for accession. However, this status does not mean that accession is imminent. Candidate status allowed the states to prepare more intensively for accession. Third, we have the negotiations. After the candidate status is granted, a long negotiation process begins between the EU and the candidate country. These negotiations are carried out in so-called negotiating chapters covering various areas of EU law and regulation, and there are a total of 35 negotiating chapters, including topics such as competition, environment, justice and fundamental rights, external relations, and others. At the start of the negotiations, a so-called screening process in which the EU and the candidate country examine the extent to which the candidate country's laws and regulations comply with those of the EU happens. The requirements of each chapter are examined in detail, and each chapter is negotiated individually. The candidate country must carry out the necessary reforms and implement EU law into its national law. A chapter is considered provisionally closed when the EU considers that the candidate country meets the necessary requirements. During the negotiations and also after the provisional closure of the chapters, the EU continuously monitors the candidate country's progress to ensure that it continues to meet its commitments. And fourth, we have the conclusion of negotiations and the accession treaty. Once all negotiation chapters have been successfully closed and the necessary reforms have been implemented, the negotiation process then finally ends. The next step is the drafting of an accession treaty that sets out all the conditions of accession. This treaty must be ratified by the EU, that means by the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament, and by the candidate country. And all existing EU member states must agree to the accession treaty. This is done usually through ratification in the national parliaments. And in some member states, there might even be the requirement for a referendum, for those who love referendums. And on fifth, we have ratification and full membership. After the accession treaty has been ratified by both the candidate country and all existing member states, accession then can officially take place. On the date set out in the treaty, the candidate country joins the EU and becomes a full member. From that point on, the new member country has the same rights and obligations as the other member states, including participation in the European Council, the Council of the European Union, the European Parliament, and other institutions of the EU. But we also have to talk about the time after accession, because there's an adaptation period. In some cases, traditional arrangements can be agreed to give the new member country time to fully adapt to certain EU rules. For example, there may be restrictions on the free movement of workers that apply for a limited period after accession. We've seen this for Romania, for example. And even after accession, the EU can continue to monitor the implementation of certain commitments, particularly in areas that were problematic during negotiations. The process of joining the EU is thorough and detailed, and that is to ensure that the new member country meets all the necessary criteria and is able to carry out its obligations as a member. And this process reflects the high priority the EU places on upholding its values, but also on protecting the rights of its citizens and ensuring the smooth functioning of the internal market. And a candidate country to join the European Union must accept a number of conditions and commit to adopting certain rules and standards. And these commitments concern both the political and economic areas and specify policy areas of the EU. And there are some very important conditions a future EU member must accept. The first is the adoption of the EU acquis, the acquis communautaire I mentioned. The EU acquis comprises all EU legislation, the treaties, regulations, directives, rulings of the European Court of Justice, as well as the common policies and international agreements that the EU has entered into. And the candidate country must fully adopt this acquis and transpose it into national law. And this means that the country must align its own laws with those of the EU. And then, of course, we have the economic integration and the participation in the internal market. The candidate country must have a functioning market economy, as I said, that is able to withstand the competitive pressure within the internal market. And the candidate country must accept and implement the 4 fundamental freedoms of the internal market. That is the free movement of goods, the free movement of people, the free movement of services, and free movement of capital. And they cannot leave out one, not even the free movement of people. And then we have the participation in the Economic and Monetary Union, the EMU. The candidate must commit to adopting the euro as its currency in the long term. This means that after joining the eurozone, the country must join as soon as it meets the so-called convergence criteria, including price stability, stable exchange rates, and budgetary discipline. However, joining the euro does not take place immediately after joining the EU, but after a separate process of economic convergence and stability. And we have joining the Schengen area. The candidate must commit to joining the Schengen area, which allows the abolition of border checks between participating countries. And here too, Schengen accession does not take place immediately after EU accession, but only when the country meets the necessary conditions, in particular in the areas of border security and judicial cooperation. And we have the recognition of political and legal commitments I mentioned earlier. The candidate must commit to the fundamental values of the EU, including democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for protection of minorities. These values are set out in Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union. The candidate accepts the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, and undertakes to comply with its rulings. And then we have the common foreign and security policy. The candidate must adopt the EU's common foreign and security policy and coordinate with the EU's positions and decisions on international affairs. And then what Kemi Badenoch, for example, will not like is the implementation of environmental standards. The candidate country must adopt the EU's extensive environmental standards set out in the various environmental laws and directives. This includes, among others, climate protection, nature conservation, water and air quality, and waste and chemicals management. And of course, which I never forget, is the agricultural policy and the structural support. The candidate country must adopt the EU's common agricultural policy, you all probably heard of CAP, which regulates agricultural production and rural areas in the member states. The candidate country must accept the EU's rules on structural and cohesion policy, which aim to reduce economic disparities between regions in the EU. And we have the participation in EU justice and home affairs policies. The candidate country must participate in EU rules on justice and internal security, including cooperation in the areas of criminal law, asylum, immigration, and police. And of course, there are financial obligations. The candidate country must participate in financing the EU by contributing to the EU budget. In return, the country gains access to EU funds, particularly from the structural funds and the common agricultural policy. So joining the EU requires a candidate state to fully adapt to EU legislation and to take on essential commitments. These conditions ensure that the country not only meets EU legal and economic standards, but also shares common political values and supports the integrity of the internal market and other common policies. The main commitments include adopting the EU acquis, adopting the euro, joining the Schengen area, accepting the EU political and legal framework, and participating in common policies in the fields of foreign policy, agriculture, the environment, and justice. And the last was just a summary of what I said before, but I guess it never harms. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.